once again, we're live.
Well, we got the next best thing right here. Go ahead.
All right, we ready to get started?
That's
Okay. Well, good evening, and welcome to Copperfield's Books presents Hank Rosenfeld in conversation with Peter Laufer. We're thrilled you could all join us tonight as we celebrate Hank's new book, The Jive 95, an oral history of America's greatest underground rock radio station, KSAN San Francisco. So the discussion tonight will be followed by a Q&A and a book signing. You can purchase your copy over by the register, and we ask that you do so before hopping in the signing line after. And Hank has agreed to personalize. He will write your names. He will do all of that stuff. So we've got you covered.
Let me kiss the baby.
So now I'm excited to introduce tonight's guests. Hank Rosenfeld grew up in Detroit, went to college in Connecticut, and moved to San Francisco in the 70s looking for the beats, where he produced news and comedy at KSAN, the Jive 95. Since then, he's been telling stories on NPR, playing pirate on a ship, broadcasting music from somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, and while writing a column at the Athens Times, getting arrested for robbing the National Bank of Greece. His folk journalism has appeared in the LA Times, SF Chronicle, Detroit News, Spy Magazine, New York Post, and other fine journals of ill repute. Hank is in conversation with journalist, author, and professor Peter Laufer. A former and longtime global correspondent for NBC News, he's covered the requisite wars and earthquakes, coups, and elections. Peter holds the James Wallace Chair in Journalism at the University of Oregon, where he was awarded the Marshall Prize for teaching innovation. He lives in Eugene, Oregon, and here in Marin County, California. So please join me in welcoming Hank Rosenfeld and Peter Laufer.
Just got back from Burning Man, so you have to
Okay. What's in these brownies?
Great. Thanks, everybody. Peter Laufer, ladies and gentlemen.
And I will stand up just because that's how I always practiced radio, standing up, and I don't know how to talk sitting down. And I want to tell you all a couple of stories before Hank starts to talk about his book. The first one goes back to a reunion we had, and maybe Terry McGovern in the back there or Bonnie Simmons on the side here can remember when that was. But Tom O'Hare, who had been program director, was the MC at that reunion, and he looked out at all of us and he said, "We all look like our uncles and aunts." And now I'm looking out at all of you, and we all look like our grandmothers and grandfathers, which is a good thing that we're still here and we're smiling. So Hank asked me to tell a couple of quick stories. One was how I came to come to work with Bonnie and eventually with Terry at KSAN, and what motivated it was when my short hair wig came off in the newsroom at KSFO, and my long hair came out of that short hair wig, and Chet Kesselman, who was the news director at the time, happened to be walking past the newsroom and fired me. So I came down the hill to 211 Sutter Street and somehow managed to get into the general manager's office. I had at that point, must have gone home, because I remember I was in Willis Duff, the general manager at the time's office, and I was barefoot. And somehow the story of what happened at KSFO combined with the hair down to here and no shoes worked.
You're a shoo-in.
Pardon?
You're a shoo-in.
I was a shoo-in, thank you very much. And so that sets the stage for, I guess, why Hank asked me to come here, because I was at the launch of the book at the Beat Museum in San Francisco. The man works very well alone. But
In North Beach, where would you put the Beat Museum, right?
But I do have a couple of notes from that event, and I will sit down and I will ask you a couple of questions, all right? The first question, get rid of the music,
Oh, I thought
please.
before
No.
that.
because we're the stars here, not the
I just
music.
want to mention
By the way, when we're done here, if you walk down Kentucky Street, there's a used record store. Out front, there's a pile of LPs they're trying to get rid of free, and one of them is a compilation done by Wolfman Jack. I was going to bring it here, but I thought it would upstage the book, so I did not bring it.
I have this great record album from one of the great KSAN DJs, Vaco. And he did the late night show.
One of my notes
Lights
from the
out.
Beat Museum is, watch your mic technique, Hank. So make
Do
sure
I
you
need one?
speak into the microphone or else yell.
It was Baco, the Madi, the expected one.
Bonnie Simmons is here. I wanted to come
And
up
Bonnie
and
Simmons
talk.
is going to be talking about the music side. Sure.
Thanks for coming out, Bonnie.
Certainly I'm crashing, actually.
Oh my
You
gosh.
can't crash, as I mentioned in the email, you're the star.
This is
So-
a thrill for me
so
because I haven't seen Bonnie.
Here's what you have to do, Hank, next, okay? Rather than schmooze Bonnie. Work on your mic technique and just tell the story of how the project came to be your project, because that story is important.
Well, yeah, I came to San Francisco like a lot of people looking for the beats. First of all, how many people remember, how many people listen to KSAN here? Okay. How many remember listening to KSAN? Okay, well, I listened to it in my taxi cab because I came looking for the beats and I was 20 years too late. It was 1978. And I was like, oh, I had to go to, because I read On the Road and was in college back east and I had to come to San Francisco. And I was driving around and picking up this radio station in my car. And it was the best radio station ever, right? We didn't talk about that back then. But I kept listening and calling in saying, you need any help? And I kept bothering these two newsmen at the time who were in the KSAN news department, which they spelled G-N-U-S. They had a sense of humor. That's why they call themselves the Jive 95, right? As a bit on a, what was it? Inside baseball. Anyway, so one night Gregory Corso got in my cab after I've been calling KSAN, and God, I just want to come in, Larry Bensky, Dave McQueen, please. They had no openings. And Gregory Corso, the famous beat poet, fell into my taxi cab, and I drove him home, and he had these granny glasses on his sweater like that. And we talked about the A's because the Oakland A's were doing really well then. I think they were 16-1. Anyway, and I thought, wow, Gregory Corso, he did like the introduction to Allen Ginsberg's book, Be a Star, Screw It. That was one of his. Boxcars, boxcars, boxcars.
Coney Island of the Mind.
Remember that? That was a visual. So I let him out at 18th and Guerrero, and he came out of the cab and gave him the money, and I just couldn't, I had to say, oh my God, all my friends in college, we all read your poems, we want to be like you, beat and beatitude and beatific, and there's nothing to do but hope because it's hopeless. And he said, I used to have some beat friends. Oh well, here we are, the 70s. And dropped him off, and the next day I volunteered in the news department because I had found the beats, ladies and gentlemen.
So tell the story, Hank, of how the project came to be and how it came to be your project, this book.
This started in 2014 at this reunion you were talking about at Yoshi's in San Francisco. And a lot of people got on stage and told stories that night, and there were some people filming there, and eventually that's going to become a KSAN documentary. But there was a guy taking notes there. It was a school teacher from San Jose area named Jeff House, and he started writing a narrative about the history of KSAN, and it was massive. And he started this in 2014, and it got to be hundreds of pages. He covered San Francisco history, Bay Area radio history, and then he died. And KSAN has a user group online. We've been doing it since the 90s, so everybody's kind of in touch if they want to be. And Norman Davis, who started the website, put the word out. Was anybody interested? Is anybody interested? Well, I've done As Told To memoirs, kind of a ghostwriter for a bunch of people. I've done three of them already. And I didn't want to do it as a narrative, but I said, I'll take on the project. And I thought, what would be a good challenge? An oral history. Never done that. So he had already interviewed a lot of the players from there, the early freaks and heads. And so I just took some of his words and then interviewed a lot of people myself and turned it into this oral history, which I hope comes off as like a conversation.
And why did you choose that format, that device, the oral history, with zero narrative in the book? It's not a trick question.
Next question. Well, I started noticing oral storytelling, we're in the golden age of that, and the New York Times has been starting to do more and more articles that are interviews, Q&As. Somebody has a new book out, let's talk to them about it. And so journalism has been changing, it's crossed over into storytelling. Of course, the new journalism, the gonzo journalism of Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson, of course, made the creative nonfiction possible. I call this is like auto nonfiction because it's sort of autobiography, it's sort of history, and it's nonfiction, but it's embellished, which I learned from the Beats. What's your question?
Embellished. In what way is it embellished?
If the person is dead, I embellished.
And what did you do to embellish?
Well,
What's
the story,
process?
you know, print the myth kind of thing. I got to KSAN at the very end, 78, 79, and then it went off in 80 and went country western when the goons came up from LA, from Metro Meaningless, and they took KSAN from its progressive rock and roll, that whole thing, the station that everybody listened to, and they went and fired all the cool kids, and Bonnie got out of there early, smart move, and went country western. But I had always heard about this station. We thought we were doing great fun, creative work. Steve Capon and Scoop Nisker was there. But I heard there was the beginning of the station, but I didn't know what it was about. And I wanted to know the original myths, the original tales, which, as Terry McGovern would tell you, it's a Rashomon. The station was a Rashomon. Everybody could tell a story in their own way of what they saw go down. And the book is basically a bunch of stories like that. So each one's a little different.
As well, it should be, because everybody experienced it differently, and especially after all these years, everybody has different memories. You mentioned Scoop, and we should take a moment to honor his memory because we lost him this summer, and he was integral to the development of the station, of course. And maybe you could mention a little something about his presence in the book and how his personality comes out in the book.
Well, he gave me a lot of stories. Scoop's been a friend. He was a mentor at KSAN for me because I came in as a news intern and I would watch him do his story. He did the last news show, which was 10 minutes every day, and he mixed tape. Can I read a little bit of it?
I think you should read a little bit of it.
Scoop gave me this story about how he started there. And the late, great, sweet generous, is that the word? Sweet generous Scoop Nisker. Wesley Scoop Nisker. There are QR codes in the book that if you click on, you can go actually hear him and some of his newscasts. He interviewed John and Yoko when they did their bed-in. In Toronto, they were allowed, Nixon wouldn't allow them in the US, so they did it from they were in it was in Montreal, I think, or Toronto. And he called them there, which was great. There's another John Lennon interview in here, which you can hear some of it on YouTube, which was done by Tom Donahue. Does that answer your question?
Not until you read a little bit, and not too much, because we want to entice the audience and not take away from your opportunity to tell stories.
This is from chapter 16. Here's Scoop, I don't know if you can see him, in the 60s, before he became Buddhist. No news is good news, but Scoop's News is the last news show. Wesley Scoop Nisker came out of Norfolk, Nebraska. He attended the University of Minnesota and hung with a blossom of Twin City hippies. Feeling San Francisco was the place to be, he loaded up the pipe and he moved west. One of his heroes was the journalist I.F. Stone, who wrote that the journalist's task was to, quote, take all the news of the world and make it sing like poetry. To this, Scoop Nisker added, news is music, music is news. So here he is. This is another DJ talking about when Scoop arrived. Stefan Ponick, you may remember, one of the great KSAN DJs as well. Stefan. Wes Nisker just came in off the street one morning with his mandolin and said, hey, I've got a song about the news and I've been hearing what you're doing and maybe I can help you do it. Those are the days. Just come in and do that. Didn't you just walk in off the street? Scoop took over the news in '68 and really ran with it to the proportion that he became famous for. If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. A classic. He was consumed by the desire to stop the war. Ended up changing the way news was presented in America. Here's Scoop. As the counterculture station, KSAN began to function as a communications center for the anti-war movement. And the main message was always the music. Rock songs were our liturgy, our anthems for the youth of the world. The young bloods singing, everybody get together. Try to love one another right now. I knew he was going to say that. For some, the call to rebellion included the call to laughter, and scorn. My own disaffection was fed by satirists like Ernie Kovacs, Sid Caesar, and Steve Allen. Since I never felt entirely at home in American society, I loved seeing it ridiculed. My first newscasts with Stefan Ponick were doing riffs influenced by Lenny Bruce and Mort Saul. We were tribal radio. After talking to people in the streets about an issue, I'd come back and mix their voices in with political speech about the subject, add the statements of a couple of cartoon characters, add sound effects affecting the scenario, and put it all together over a rock song or looping an Indian raga. It would take about 2 hours to complete a 5-minute piece. Politicians' words on tape revealed either the hidden truth or the essential nonsense of what was being said. In May 1970, mourning the Kent State protesters, I mixed Nixon's voice with students, soldiers, and the Woodstock album version of the Jefferson Airplane's Volunteers of America. The true hippie agenda called for spiritual revolution, so I started interviewing Buddhist, Hindu, and Sufi teachers who came through San Francisco. With the growing countercultural interest in Asian traditions, they were offering Western hippies new ways to pray and get high.
So this is an example I would suggest of how the book brings the moment to life for those who experienced it and for those who missed it. And it's also a reminder of how innovative the station was, particularly how innovative Scoop was. There have been all sorts of followers in radio and elsewhere with audio that never have come up, at least in my experience, to that level. It's in some ways the same across the station. Wouldn't you suggest that it was there, it's not there anymore, and it is not replicable?
Well, like you tell a story in the book about, it was the first big oil spill in San Francisco Bay between the bridge and Alcatraz. It was a Chevron. It was 1971, January. And KSAN became the clearinghouse. The KSAN listeners started the center for cleaning up the beaches and cleaning the birds was KSAN. There was no internet to reach everybody. People called in, put it out on the air, everybody went out, whatever they got from the phone call. Volunteers came in and manned the phones. There were people cleaning birds in the freaking lobby. Dusty Street, I think, still said that. And Peter, you want to talk about what
Well, it
KSAN
just was
meant?
an example of the potency of the radio station. And it was of a time, as you say, it was before other devices that we have now that can bring community together. But the radio station was a community center, mostly via the airwaves.
Peter, since you're talking about that, may I interject the idea of when farm camp did every week?
Yeah, come on.
Yeah, but come up here and use a
No,
microphone, Terry.
you please tell me.
No, you come up here. Terry, you'll tell the story better. Come here. Come up here,
All
Terry.
right, I'll tell it. Screw you all.
Farm Chem was a company down around Stanford. and it was
Farm
a-
Chem.
Farm
He's-
Chem.
he's
Palo Alto.
Take that microphone,
What are
Terry.
you translating me?
I just said he's Palo Alto.
You don't need
you
it?
said- I know you
You don't
said.
need mic?
Anyway, it was this company, they were chemists. They weren't politicians, they didn't, I don't know if they had political views or not, but every Friday, they called KSAN and we taped their report and played it on my show in the morning, midday and evening, and it was as follows. Look out for the brown acid, it's got strychnine in it. There are also some capsules going around that are blue and green in color, be very careful. And they were literally telling the drug users, of which we had many in our audience, myself
You inside
included,
the station.
that if you take these drugs, you can end up dead. To me, that's one of the greatest public services I've ever heard about in a radio station. And we advertised that, we broadcast that thanks to this young woman back there and the chutzpah she had.
Farther than that, we set it up at Farm Camp so that you could take your sample of whatever it is you wanted to have tested, and you came up with your own 5-digit number, and you sent them a little tiny smidge of it. And then when we would do the Farm Chem report, a week later, we had a list of the 5-digit numbers, and we could, on the air, report to people what they had, and they could match up their numbers.
So one of the things that's perhaps interesting for you to talk about that you deal with in some detail in the book, Hank, is how this kind of public service that Terry and Bonnie are talking about, which was not the usual role of corporate America, how that marriage occurred between those of us who were on the air and Metro Media, this conglomerate of radio stations nationwide, owned by a corporation that was in the business of making money.
Yeah. Well, KSAN was the station, the one that everybody listened to. It was kind of like Ben Fontoria said, people say it was a community station, even though it was commercial, because the people at KSAN were part of the community. They went to the same stores, the same head shops, the same record stores, the same Pacific Stereo shops, and they were out in the community. And Ben Fontoria is also a great DJ at KSAN. Ben Fontoria is Rolling Stone editor for many years. He was, anyway, there's a million stories he tells in here. He and Joel Sullivan, these three people were incredibly helpful to this book. But he said that KSAN was kind of like the Craigslist of its day. You would call to find out where the rallies were, or you would tune in to hear about where they were. If you lost a dog, you called in. If you needed a roommate, you called in. If you needed a ride somewhere. KSAN, all that, right? The ride board, the this board, the that. And that's what a community radio station, and when I drive around the country, I just came up from Santa Monica, you pick up these stations and they're like KSAN's grandchildren, or KSAN's children. They're all over the country. Like Jim Morrison has children all over the country, which I guess are grandchildren now. KSAN seeds are everywhere, and there is freeform. I was on this morning in Rohnert Park, freeform. KPCA, people play whatever the hell they want, like you guys did, and from their own record collection, which is how KMPX started. And that's the freedom of radio, and KSAN did that and stayed the progressive line, and then Hello Reagan comes in 1980. So just before that, corporation clamped down.
Bonnie wanted to add something to this.
Come on up and talk about it, Bonnie.
Come get the microphone, Bonnie.
What you're talking about just reminds me of a couple of things that
Yeah.
always struck me as interesting things to think about when you consider what the world was like then and what the world is like now.
Thanksgiving, right?
One of them is that every day, 3 times a day, we did something called listeners' personals. And you could come to the station or you could send in any information that you wanted out there. Like if you wanted a ride to LA, because you had to get to LA, you could do a listener's personal and you would put your phone number out there and say, is anybody going to LA? I can share in paying the gas. Or I lost my dog, or my cat, or any service that you were trying to do, you could get hooked up. And we never, if you thought about doing that now, I mean, think about even whether you even want to give your phone number out. You know, and I do know that anecdotally, Ben often talks about the fact that through a listener's personal is how he met his wife Diane. And they just celebrated their
Close to
something crazy, close to 50 anniversary. The other thing was that we did this thing right before Thanksgiving every year called the KSAN Turkey Exchange. And people that had room at their Thanksgiving table would give us the information and they'd say, we're vegan, we're having tofurkey and broccoli, and we have 2 seats at our dining room table. And if anybody would like to come share Thanksgiving dinner with us, here's our phone number. Or people would write in and say, I just got to town, I don't have anywhere to go for Thanksgiving, you know, I'd love to share your Thanksgiving with us. We hooked up thousands of people going into each other's houses for Thanksgiving, and I never heard anybody tell us horror story.
Yeah.
You know, if you did that in 2023, can you imagine? You know, it was a remarkable time.
But you guys, all three, have not answered the question.
What's the
How
question?
did this marriage occur between John Kluge and Metro Media and us so that we could do the kinds of things we're talking about and the corporate entity
I
did?
never got an answer to that either.
They were, first of all, they were based on the East Coast. John Kluge never came here once. He came to KSAN once.
Metro Media.
Metro Media, yeah. And
Metro Media was our corporate
He came to
owner. It does
KSAN.
not exist any longer.
he came to KSAN once, and I remember John Kluge was very proud of his collection of German lithographs. And when we first got to KSAN, all the walls were covered in these sort of dark, creepy, no offense, but just kind of depressing German lithography. And so we, of course, took them down because we wanted to put up posters or put up whatever we wanted to put on the walls. And when Kluge was going to come out, we had to go find the German lithographs in the basement and put them back up on the walls. I do remember that. They left us alone.
They
To tell you the
certainly did,
truth,
for the most part.
They basically left us alone. When we first started, AM was still much more of the king of radio, not FM. And they, for the most part, if we didn't get in too much trouble and we were continuing to make more and more money as the station became more popular,
Here's what they did.
they pretty much left us alone.
Hey, wait a minute, you guys.
They came in and did this.
They did do
Yeah,
that.
no, they did.
But
They
The
were,
kids are doing great.
Stop for a minute, and Bonnie, get out of that chair.
Oh, I'm
and
sorry.
Let the author back in the chair, and give the
I'm
author the
sorry, I
microphone.
But it's an oral history, so we're all on it,
Yes.
really, aren't we?
No, no,
I
no.
apologize.
Listeners, too.
It's gonna happen again.
Of course it is. So Hank,
How do you know so much about it, man?
Just grew up in it,
Hank,
down in the peninsula.
Oh, man.
I don't know how I got this job as MC and cattle wrestler.
Because you're a news
Wrangler,
guy.
yes.
The news guy has to wrangle.
So did you, in the book, answer that question? How did this marriage work properly? Is it what Bonnie and Terry just said, that we were making so much money that they figured leave us alone? Is it that they were far away and not paying attention? And before you answer those two questions, while you think about them, while you diss John Kluge's art collection, I have to tell you that I came over from KSFO, but prior to that I was at KNEW, which also was a Metro Media station. And there was this, John Kluge's art collection was there too, over at the Port Authority building in Oakland. And there was this spectacular, huge image of Lyndon Baines Johnson in a Santa Claus suit, pulling up his shirt, showing the scar from his operation. And that was what I walked into as a 16-year-old kid every day going to work as a copy boy. Now, how is it that this marriage?
Before I answer that, I'm gonna tell you something else, buddy.
Yeah, what is it?
I'll think of it.
Okay.
Ken Kesey tells a story in here. There were some Ken Kesey tapes that I liberated from
This
the
is not in response
basement.
to the question.
LBJ, the story about LBJ showing his, I got a scar from here to my goddamn car. Kesey said one night with the pranksters, they all decided to give this guy a chance, LBJ. And so he said, well, let's take a bunch of brownies. And they all sat around a circle and watched TV that night. And here came LBJ, and it was his speech about, I can't do it. I can't do it anymore. I'm a big Texan. It's hard to say, for me to say, but it's too tough. I gotta get out. This war is killing me. And he said, all of a sudden, we all saw this media wrapper around this guy, what the media had portrayed. And a human being came out, and Johnson, big guy, said, I can't do it anymore. And Kesey said, that's the way the revolution is won. Because we didn't put any judgment into that image. We put love and affection. And he gave it back.
So do you have a further answer? You don't have to answer that. I have one more question for you, and then I think we should open it up to either Bonnie and Terry monopolizing the evening or questions from the audience, whichever you prefer. At any rate,
I have an answer for that.
Constantly.
you do have an answer.
Yeah,
Okay.
it comes from Joel Selvin, who was also very helpful with the book. Joel Selvin, the San Francisco Chronicle fame, wonderful music columnist, and knew Tom and knew everybody at the station, and he's written a lot of great books. So, Ben Functori says, Tom was making deals. Tom Donahue is, of course, the hero of this book. None of us would be here if not for him. The last time I saw Tom, Joel Selvin says, was about a week before he died, 1975. There was some bay cruise or something. We were up in the captain's cabin, we're snorting a lot of blow, and Tom was getting really nostalgic. He said something like, 10 years ago, we'd all be on LSD. Now, I don't have any great nostalgia for 10 years ago, but I made note of that, right? Tom is so hip, and he's looking for the next thing already. There was a story that Francis Coppola was going to put money behind a news station in '75 when Tom would go do
They
it.
were meeting. I was in
They were
all the
having meetings?
I was there at all the meetings at Francis's house. That's absolutely true.
Well, Ben Functori says he was making deals to the end, and as Tommy's mother says, he never turned the corner. He never got that financial edge to be really comfortable. And Selvin goes on, Tom had those plans. He was ready to jump into the next thing, the next big thing. He brought Metro to their knees. And as long as he had his guys selling off the top of the card and full booking, he just told them to fuck themselves. And they said, okay, Tom, thank you. Tom could do anything he wanted to do with that station. There was no corporate control on him at all. None.
That definitely answers the question. So one more question, and then open it up to the folks here, yeah? The question is, we've got an audience of friendlies, obviously. Why would this book be of interest to somebody who wasn't in the Bay Area at the time, who wasn't listening to the radio station, who isn't a radio junkie? What is the draw of the book outside of this room?
You mean for geezers our age?
For anybody who reads the book, if anybody besides
Because
people
it's
like this
I would
read the
say
book.
it's an important part of the counterculture revolution that's not taught in the schools. It's in the history of the United States, but we don't learn about it. Kids don't learn about it. Do you remember that movie that came out a few years ago about the Chicago 7? Where, about Abby and all those great guys? That should be shown in history classes to learn what went on in this country. In KSAN covered all those things, of course. But if anybody's interested in that period where all this stuff was happening at the same time, as Kesey said, it was all cooking like a good fudge. It was all swirling, and the timing Everything is timing in this life. And KSAN was right there when all these people showed up in San Francisco in '67, and they didn't know how to get together and connect with each other. They didn't even know there were other people like them, heads and freaks. And then they had a be in the Golden Gate Park, and they all saw each other for the first time, and they had a radio station. And anybody who can remember that time, and yeah, that was something. There was something really great about that. I think can relate to this book.
I think you're right. I think absolutely you're right. So Bonnie and Terry are here, as
I
is
think the
Hank.
reason that it's a good read for people who don't really didn't experience the story, because it sounds like great fiction.
And it felt like it at times.
It did while it was there.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And by the way, Terry, in terms of self-indulgence, I have to tell you, if we've never talked about this, that the poodle in the microwave turned out to be an urban legend.
They don't know what's good. You know, I have kind of guarded the feelings about telling too many of the stories, because after all, that's what's in the book, and you should get the book to enjoy them. But I don't think this is in the book. This was an experience, my first experience with this bird. He and I both had worked at KSFO, and he got to KSAN before me, and I'm on the air, and I was a nervous wreck. New guy, kind of the straight guy, the short hair, no beard, and all that. And I was on a probation period, and I'm standing there doing my show, and I played a song, I played a record, and I went about my business getting the next set ready, and he comes flying through the door. Stop what you're doing. Reaches down and grabs the tone arm and pulls it off the record. Opens his microphone and says, Chicago. A woman in a hurry to get to an appointment decides to wash her poodle. Impatient that the poodle wasn't drying properly, she put it in the microwave. It exploded. Now, it's a totally untrue story. I hate cruel animal stories, but it wasn't true. It was totally made up by some AP or UPI writer who was bored. But this guy, this is what he got away with doing on my radio show. And that's how I met him. And I after the show was over, I said, who are you? What was that all about? It's an important story. Don't tell me it's not an important story.
How old were you?
20.
20 years old. Did
Bonnie,
anybody-
do you want to say something before we give it to the audience?
I always think it's more fun to hear what people in the audience.
I think
I
so
would
too.
love to hear that.
Yes.
And by the
So-
way, anybody who doesn't know what Bonnie's role was, I have to tell you this.
Yes, good.
She was the teenager in charge. She was my boss, our boss. This young woman who
I
had
started there when I was.
Tom's complete.
Come with the microphone if you're going to wear the mask.
Come darling, all the way from Sebastopol. Come over
I
here.
think I was 20, but I had,
Bonnie Simmons, ladies and gentlemen.
been very close friends with Dusty Street and her husband, Luther, and my ex-husband, Bob. So I was around all the KSAN people.
Yeah, he's a
Mormon. Oh, okay.
I was around all of the KSAN folks because of that much earlier than when I actually managed to get a job. I don't usually tell it because I feel like it's a story I've told way too many times, but I applied, the first time I applied for a job, every 6 months, one of the full-time disc jockeys would get made the music director. And 6 months later, it would go to another full-time disc jockey because having to be the music director actually was a lot of work and nobody really wanted to do it. And at the time, Tony Pigg was the music director. And I applied for the record librarian's job and I did not get it because he told me that he felt that he had to hire a Virgo. But Tony gave up being the music director and Dusty Street became the music director. And it was Dusty that gave me the job, and I came into KSAN as the record librarian and the public service director. And then I was there, 9 years? And in that time, I did every job there was in the building except being a salesperson.
But you were program director for several years.
Many years, yeah, a number of years, operations director, program director, music director, disc jockey, whatever.
And then went to
The
KPFA.
greatest job ever
You were terrific.
that I had was record librarian. What could be better to be 20 years old
Was.
and be, the record library was right in the middle of the old KSAN building. And you were surrounded by the shelves of records, and every musician that came in, every disc jockey, every day, the first place they would come is to stop by the record library and just see what's going on. And, you know, it was like for a 20-year-old person in San Francisco, it was like being at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And I think all of us at KSAN, you know, we made no money. I think I started, maybe I made $75 a week starting, and I think of when I left, I was up a few times that, but not much. But I don't think any of us, I felt like, I can't believe that I get to do this every day and they pay me.
We were at the
It's
center of the
crazy.
universe
It
of
was
our
crazy.
universe.
Yeah.
So let's hear from you all, please. And I see a hand there, and if you've got a loud voice, just stand up.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're welcome to a microphone.
So my introduction, I have a little story and then a question. My introduction was, I lived in Gilroy, which is 80 miles south of San Francisco, and good reception. My father was probably a Republican and definitely for the war, and I was definitely not a Republican and not for the war. But we had a decent relationship. Anyway, one afternoon, we're out in front of the house, and he says, listen to this, you might want to, I've been hearing this interesting music on this station, on FM. I used to listen to KFRC, which is the AM, and anyway, so listen to this, and it was Ravi Shankar playing probably some 15-minute raga, which he thought was cool, right? And I did too. Well, this is great. So I turned up the radio in the old 62 Ford Falcon in the driveway. The next thing on after Dad left was probably Quicksilver Messenger Service and some live set from the Fillmore playing for 15 minutes. And I'm all like, oh yeah. And that, you know, that was it for AM radio. And that was at KMPX, I believe, and then it went to KSAN. The recollection I have, though, my question is, at some point, I remember hearing the first like factory-produced nationwide, like a Coke commercial, and it was prior to that, all the commercials I think were just produced by KSAN and the folks that wandered in with them. I remember hearing that, feeling like, oh my God, this is so weird. It's the beginning of the end, and I don't know when that was, but if you have any.
Well, I know that Terry and Bonnie and probably Hank will have a response, but I have to take advantage of my MC role to say something here that my wife Sheila said is a story I should tell tonight, and that is doing the morning news one time. Somebody presented me with something I had never heard of called tie stick, and that was ingested in some manner right prior to the news, and the newscast, which was 5 minutes, contained nothing but my laughter and the canned produced spot for Bank of America. And I somewhere in my files still have the memo from the general manager at the time, Willis Dove, suggesting that should not occur again.
You were laughing over the Bank of America.
No, the newscast, the 5 minutes were nothing but laughter, and then there was the canned spot.
One of the classic commercial stories, we fought as much as we could and as hard as we could, but you know, there did come a point where waterbed stores and record stores could not support everything that was going on in KSAN. And we ended up taking some nationally produced commercials as we became more popular, and it cost more per minute to put your ads on the radio
By the way,
station.
I kept listening, just,
So
I didn't tune you out, but.
We got this contract to do this horrible spot for Banaka breath spray. Remember Banaka?
got this, and the spots were just atrocious. So we got together in the production studio and we made our own Banaka spot. But we may have neglected to tell the salesperson that we changed the Banaka spot, and we ran this thing. Unbeknownst, months later, there's a competition. There's a national advertising competition every year. And I can't remember who did it, but somebody at the station loved the Banaka spot we made, and they entered it in the competition, and it won.
You want a Clio?
It won a Clio award. That's a big, big thing in advertising. The Banaka people and the advertising agency for the Banaka people obviously found out about this because they won a Clio, and it was not their commercial when they heard it. We ended up having to run like 10 times more of their horrible Banaka commercial than we had ever gotten paid for at the very beginning.
But we did work hard to try to prevent that from happening. We failed, but that was part of the compromise that we were
When I
talking
got
about
there,
earlier.
you guys, and I came from the straight advertising world. My dad was a madman, you know, the AJ was an agency guy. I grew up in the commercial radio, AM radio. The commercials were sacrosanct, you know.
Yeah.
They really were. When I get to KSAN, I don't know, I guess I heard it on somebody else's show, but talking, then music, and then more talking, and then the commercials started, and you couldn't hear it. But you was like, they turned them down. And I thought, oh my God, you're gonna be assassinated for this, you can't do this. But you got away with it for a long time until we did not.
Questions from all of you, or comments, or something? Yes, ma'am. And next to you, sir.
I have a comment about who should read the book. And I think everybody here who has a grandchild or a child who's young enough to not remember some of those times, or a niece or a nephew or a neighbor who's young, they need to read
It's a
it.
great chronicle.
They need to read it because they look at us, I'm saying us because, you know, a lot of you and I are the same age. They look at us as oldish guys who don't really know anything, kind of past their prime, and you know, you should be nice to them, but they don't really know, right? Isn't that what you experience? They need to know how we were in our power days. So I recommend that you get it
That's
for
a
a youngster.
terrific
And
point.
can
That's
I
a
add something
terrific
to
point.
that? Thank you for that. I totally agree with you. And another thing they will learn is they will learn the history of an appliance that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, that's so true, Terry, because I have these large lecture classes at the University of Oregon, and they don't know what
That's
bake
the
light
best
is, that's for
response
sure.
I've ever gotten.
But they have no idea what a radio
No,
is.
they don't.
And it is, and that's an important point, that the
That little
book
box
also
that we had in
is
every room in the
history.
car, and this is-
Sir, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah.
Stand up, please.
Thank you.
That's all right, it's a quickie. Do you have
Stand
any
up, stand up,
stories
stand up so we can hear you.
Do you have any stories about any legal trouble you might have gotten into? for
Well,
something
let's
you
move to
should
the
not
author
have
here,
put on the
because
air?
there is a story
My
that if
fault.
Bonnie tells the
My
story, we'll
fault.
be here till midnight.
Bonnie has, here's another one.
One thing I was thinking when you were asking about how it kind of came together was a lot of these kind of extemporaneous conversations. A lot of people didn't sit down and, you know, type out what their memories of the history of these sort of things were. In a conversation, it kind of was like a brainstorm. It's like, ooh, and that occurs to me, and then
Right, and that's what Hank alluded to earlier, that the book is mythology as much as news reporting. Hank, will you talk about an incident where the FCC, legal, et cetera, do the short version, because as I said, if Bonnie does it, we're here till midnight.
I was the one that was responsible for it.
All right, tell the story, Bonnie, tell the story. Tell the short
No,
version.
somebody else can
Hank,
tell
tell the
that.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you have to come up here and sit down with the microphone
set you up.
where Bonnie is.
how many years have
No,
you been
here,
on
sorry. I'm
KPFA?
sorry. Here.
I will sit at your feet anytime, Bonnie.
How long have I been at KPFA? 30.
She's on the air right now, actually.
33 years. Through the wonder of remote broadcasting.
So
I have
you
one
went
year.
directly from KSAN to KPFA?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
I have all kinds
I
of
thought,
other
yeah,
things
yeah.
that
Are you
I've
gonna
done.
write a book, Bonnie?
I'm getting over here.
Did you
Where's
do
the
that?
memoir, Bonnie?
I'll just keep talking.
Do you need a
Bonnie, you got a
ghostwriter?
question back here, are you gonna write a book?
Dusty?
So, I believe
She believes.
in one of the things that is beautiful about radio is that it gets said or it gets sung, it goes out into the ether and it disappears. And I actually like that very much about radio.
Live radio, live radio.
But it comes back
Yes.
around.
Yes.
Hank, tell your story,
Peter
please.
Bergman of the Firesign Theater, you may remember. Great
Sit there in the
late
waiting room.
Peter,
Wait here.
yeah, wait here in the sitting room. He told me something. He said, theater is church, cinema is art, radio is breath, and television is furniture.
Radio is what?
Radio's breath,
Breath.
you know, and it's in and out. Paul Krasner guested host the show. Paul Krasner, one of the greats, co-founded the Yippies, and he had a newspaper a magazine called The Realist for years, which was like Mad for adults. Or Ramparts, which was another great San Francisco magazine. So he guest hosted, and he had Margot St. James, head of Coyote, call off your old tired ethnic San Francisco, or Coyote, which was a union of prostitutes?
Working sex workers, yeah.
Sex workers union, only in San Francisco. And she simulated going down on him on the air. And he said, you know, it's radio, it's theater of the mind. The audience doesn't know, they can imagine it. And then she went on and did the next show, which was
Dr. Hip.
Dr. Hippocrates, Eugene Schoenfeld. He was gonna come tonight, but he's down in Southern California tonight. And he had her on, and they got into a discussion of all sorts of inside baseball, we'll put it. And a letter came in, and the FCC and
By today's standards, it was all so tame, but go ahead.
yeah, it was tamed by today's standards. Howard Stern
And a fellow named Silverman, that's how strong the memory is,
Wow.
wrote a letter.
One letter to
One
the
letter.
FCC complaining.
Continue, Hank.
all it takes is one to spill that whole barrel of fun. What were we talking about? Krasner, and then Dr. Hippocrates, Eugene Schoenfeld, who had a wonderful sex, talk about anything on the air, you could take calls. He also had a column in the Berkeley Barb or the San Francisco Alternative Express paper where it was really helpful for listeners and kids getting involved with sex at 14, 15, and they had questions. So they went over the line for this one listener, wrote a letter, he wrote the FCC in San Francisco, and KSAN almost lost its license. And Herb Cain wrote about it a lot in the paper, and comparing KSAN to Lenny Bruce, and you know, being that dirty. And then what?
That's, well,
Sorry, am I
go ahead.
allowed? Should I?
just give the addendum.
Metro Media had a lawyer, a hard-drinking, incredibly fabulous lawyer.
Can you hear?
I can't remember his last name. He defended us.
Wasn't Tony Serra, was it?
Defended us,
No.
from Boston, Metro Media lawyer, not our guy, high-priced. Came out, he defended us in this. He wrote the brief that was submitted to the FCC to argue this. He entitled it Sex in Broadcasting, and he had it printed on the covers of the briefs. And it became like folk legend in Washington DC. Everybody wanted a copy of the transcript of his brief. But his argument was that San Francisco, city of Lenny Bruce, and many other fabulous creations to come, had a different ethical and moral standing than anywhere else in the United States, and that what we had done on the air was entirely fitting in San Francisco.
Because community standards
Right.
is the baseline.
Right.
And so the reality is, we didn't just have this relationship with the corporate entity, but we also had a special relationship with the FCC. We followed the rules to not lose the license. And the episodes such as this were extremely rare because we knew that without the license, we were out on the street. It's 8 o'clock, we've been here about an hour. We could go, as I said, easily to midnight just with stories from Bonnie and Terry. But we want to give you a chance to buy the book and come over here and talk to Hank and get his signature. If somebody's got a burning question and you
I have a
want to do
comment.
it first before we break up, please do
Hi,
ask the
okay,
story.
my name's Rob.
Ask the question.
And I just wanted to make a comment. I met Terry a few years ago. I run the radio station in Petaluma.
KSAN General Manager. right?
And,
Tell them.
okay, so I met Terry a few years ago he wanted to think about coming on and having a show on KPCA, local radio. And he was telling me about an encounter when he first went to KSAN and talked to Tom Donahue. And he asked Tom, he says, well, you know, I've come from middle of the road radio. And Tom said, you know what, he said, why do you want me?
Literally a term, MOR radio, later it was
Right.
AOR.
And so,
middle of the road, music that didn't offend anybody, it was just straight down the middle.
right. And so Terry asked Tom, why do you want me here? And Tom said, well, we're middle of the road also. It's just a different road.
So I want to say something here before we send you to the cash register. I told Hank a story when the book first came out, and he was talking about having events like this that are just so lovely, so precious, and it's so nice to see you all. And I said, be careful. I wrote a book about talk radio, and I packed book passage, and there was wine, and there was cheese, and there were great questions. And I counted the people. There were 60 people in the room. And I said, Hank, I sold 6 books that night. I just don't want to do that kind of stuff anymore. Are you sure you want to go to a bookstore and talk to people? And he said, yeah, I want to do it. I want to meet the readers. So you guys have to be readers. Get in there and buy a book. Get in there and buy a book and bring it over here. And Hank will be here, and Terry will be here, and Bonnie will be here.
I'm buying a book.
And Bonnie's going to buy the first book, and the rest of you are going to buy at least a book. And we're going to lock the door until you do. So thank you very much, Hank. Thank you, Bonnie, for being here. Thank you, Terry, for being here. And thank all of you for being